Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am not that Weems guy, but I am actually Sherman House standing in for Lee Weems this week. I will tonight be the Joey Bishop to his Johnny Carson. So thank you for tuning in tonight. And we've got an excellent panel of guests here. We're going to talk about a few interesting things that haven't been talked about on here before. But I'm going to have everybody go around the room and introduce themselves. Tammy, ladies first.
Okay. I'm Tammy Bartles, and I am a firearms instructor here in Lawrence, Kansas, which is just a little west of um, Kansas City, Kansas. Own my own training company, Red Brick. It's been a long weekend. Red Brick Road Training.
Okay,
Never been a
very
cop
good.
or anything fun like that. So,
Okay, cool. Let's see, Randy Harris.
I'm Randy Harris with Harris Combative Strategies, located in Chattanooga, Tennessee, but I'm willing to travel to you if you've got a range that wants to host me. I'm not sure what else you want me to tell you, but that's pretty much the highlights.
Well,
I've been
you have probably more firearms training than just about anybody.
I've got a fair amount, yeah. I've
Yeah,
trained significantly with Tom Givens, Craig Douglas, Gabe Suarez, Tom Sotis on the knife side, Dave Spalding a bunch of times, um,
James Yeager.
Gabe White, yeah. So a whole bunch of folks. So
Cool,
and
very
I shoot
good.
okay. So
Yeah, you do. Um, John Hearn. Everybody
So
knows who
yes,
you
this
are,
is
but tell us anyway.
yeah, this is John Hurt. I'm the guy everybody makes fun of. As somebody asked me a tack, and I goes, I don't get it. You seem really nice in person. Why does everybody hate you so much? So I guess it is one of the great mysteries of life. Most of y'all know who I am. I just did the math. Depressing number 37-year public safety career. The last 31 of those in law enforcement. Kind of had this dual track where I was working in the field as a law enforcement officer or a field supervisor, also doing a lot of researching, speaking, all that kind of stuff since 2005. Range master staff instructor since like '01. And I don't shoot as well as Randy, but every once in a while I pull something out of my hat and it turns out okay.
Didn't you guys both get a turbo pin in
yeah,
Gabe's class the same day?
yep.
Oh, yes. I'm
Yeah,
number 7 and he is.
Number 8.
gotcha. I was there. Did not get a turbo pin, but I saw it. I saw it happen. Um, that's the thing that I try and do different about these shows is not talk like I know the answer. It's hard to do because it's you want to have a regular conversation with people that you're friends with, right?
Pull
But
it out of us.
when the audience is listening, they feel like they're not on in any of the inside jokes. So I'm gonna if I ask you a question and it sounds like it's purposefully vague or requiring you to be expository, that's why. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk about tonight was the aspect of emotional control and how it um, contributes to success in preparation, training, and of course, in facing existential threats. So, Lee kind of sprung this on me the other day and said, "Hey, do you want to stand in and be the guest host?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "What do you want to talk about?" And and I said, been nobody's talked about emotional control yet, have they? And I'm trying to think like, has anybody talked about emotional control on any of the other podcasts that we commonly listen to? And I couldn't think of any. So I thought, well, there's no time like the present. And so I hit up John because he's talked about it before in conversation with me as well. So I thought that this would be an appropriate time for it. So there was a quote by Jordan Peterson that kind of made the rounds probably about a year ago. And, you know, Jordan Peterson is a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, also a big student of Jung. And, he did a lot of exploration of a concept that he called the shadow self. And I think that Jordan Peterson kind of dovetailed this into his own sort of interpretation, but I thought it was relevant to our discussion. And he said, quote, "You should be a monster because everyone says you should be harmless or virtuous. You should sheath your competitive instinct. You shouldn't try and win. No, wrong. You should be an absolute monster and then learn how to control it." And so, I think about that, and I think about, in my experience as a peace officer, and then also working in public safety, as a fireman and as an EMT, but then also just in my life, you meet so many people that have destructive capability, but they have no handle on it whatsoever. So much so that they may have all of the implements and the capabilities, but they're literally harmless because they can't bring any of that to bear. Kind of on an opposite end of that is I was thinking about this, looking at some notes that I have from the past in discussions with John, that the aspect of emotional control is kind of what unites like special operations soldiers, SWAT police officers, like technical patrol officers, with the people who are like military test pilots, astronauts, surgeons. All of these people, all of these professions and all these vocations require a high aspect of emotional control in their abilities to be successful with whatever they're trying to complete. So let's see. I think I can do that, John. I don't quite know how, but I will make it happen. Let's see.
Guys, this is my fault. I asked Sherman to enable screen sharing, and we are not the world's best gee whiz tech bang when it comes to Zoom. It's one step removed from a caveman staring at fire and going, when it comes to some of this stuff.
Exactly.
I wasn't sure who the message was, to, so I clicked on share screen. It says the host has disabled it. So
if you can't, it's not a big deal, dude.
How about well, that ain't it. Okay. I'm not sure, John. I'm sorry.
It's good.
you are front and center, John.
Well, my friend, so all right. So I think that Sherman makes a really, really good point, because you can possess all the skill in the world, but if you can't bring it to bear, it does you absolutely no good. And Sherman, for instance, was talking about some of the higher end military units. Well, there's a reason that there's a selection process. They're going out of their way to try to find individuals who have the attributes they want. And I would say probably the biggest attribute they're looking for is that facet of emotional control. We have a running joke in the industry. It's like, how will you know somebody's a Navy SEAL? And the response to that is, don't worry, they'll tell you. But one of the things about the SEALs, because they've been so open about their screening program and their selection program, is you know what they make people do. You know to a certain degree why and at what points they fail. So the SEALs are famous for setting people out in this horrendous surf. They're basically going to make you intentionally hypothermic, make you want to quit, because cold demoralizes and equalizes everything. Right? So there's a bunch of guys that are going to punch out in that first week where they're just absolutely ruthless to them. So at that point, they've got the guys that have the mental toughness to harden it out, and they need to figure out who has the emotional control to do this job. And the way they do this is they have this activity called pool comp, where they have a horribly antiquated diving system, right? Nobody would actually use this thing in the real world, but the emergency procedures are well established, right? So what they'll do is they'll teach them how to use this antiquated dive apparatus. They'll teach them all the emergency responses, and then they will literally put them in the pool and try to kill them. And there is no shame. My understanding is there is no shame in pool comp of fighting the technical problem with the breathing gear until you pass out and go unconscious. All I think anybody can ask somebody to do in combat is to fight till the lights go out. That is a reasonable request. I think Bill Jeans first said that. So what they're screening for, though, is there are people who, when they get, again, in that environment where they can't breathe, that ability just to, no matter what is going on around you, to run that checklist, fight your way through it, no matter what's happening, is what all these units are screening for as far as that stuff goes. And again, if you don't have the emotional control, it doesn't matter how much skill you have on the day the flag flies. You've got to have the emotional control to bring that. Something I said earlier was like, you could, rank skill on, 0 to 100. You might have somebody who's a really gifted shooter who's a 90, but if they lose half of that when they get stressed out, that's not impressive. You can have somebody who's like a 70, barely passes quals and stuff like that. But if that person doesn't lose that skill when the chips are down, that is a huge advantage. And I think it's one of those things that we recognize it philosophically, but we don't talk about it, which is why I guess we're glad we're here. Like, how do you build this stuff? Where do we see it playing out? That sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. What are some things in your research, John, that you've discovered that people can do to, polish or better harness emotional control? Or is it something that like you're stuck with what you're stuck with and what you've developed with through your life, and that's what you have to deal with?
So I would say it's a combination of stuff. First off, there is a certain genetic component, I think, to all this kind of stuff. If we look at like the big five personality characteristics, you mentioned Jordan Peterson, he loves the big five. You have what openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. We know from the research that people that have higher trait neuroticism are more likely to freeze under high stress situations. So I think we all bring to the table a certain amount, but we also bring with us the ability to shape that. And I think that what's important to recognize about mindset is it's not a verb. Craig Douglas famously said that you can't mindset yourself out of a situation. Mindset is a lifelong pursuit. Since not many of us are going to get into drop down nasty fights to the death on a regular basis, what we're going to have to find is all the valuable analogs that might offer us something. And I think that there's this famous quote. I can't find a good source for it. I just know the quote. It says, first man makes habits and then habits make the man. Okay. If you do nothing, you're never going to develop mindset. If you go out, and I don't care what the field is, what the endeavor is, if you go out and you challenge yourself, if you're uncomfortable, if you've got butterflies in your stomach, any of those moments from butterflies into your stomach to a complete adrenaline dump flight response, all those have uses. So um, in the field that we're talking about, more self-defense, just having high levels of competency with your skills is going to give you a certain degree of mindset, because the body is going to have the mind is going to have faith in those. Physical fitness is one of those really, really easy areas. I end up sounding like everybody's mom, eat right, exercise, and get lots of sleep. But we can look at things like heart rate variability, which is a really good capture of all those things. Heart rate variability is a huge predictor of success in a variety of high stress endeavors, whether it's athleticism or special operations missions. So, just exercise, being in good shape, challenging yourself. Cecil and I did the value of BJJ episode earlier this year. I think that regularly putting yourself in those situations where panic is a natural, if panic is a natural response and you have to overcome it, that activity probably has some value. When I was 35 years old, I decided to jump out of a perfectly good airplane. Not something I necessarily want to do or my wife will allow me to do every day, but it was definitely an uncomfortable situation. It makes you carry out a certain list of, actions in a certain order and remain calm. So there's almost no limit to the stuff that you can do to help develop mindset. Jeff Cooper famously noted activities such as racing cars has value. I was just reading the good book here. Cooper, everybody forgets, we're going back and we're looking at this self-defense subject matter with this eye of a critical thinker. And I think sometimes we forget that dudes smarter than us have done this, right? So here's principles of personal defense. And one of his principles is just the idea of coolness. And he says, you must keep your head. That's one of the direct quotes. And he says, remember, when it comes to go to guns, that it is only as good as your ability to keep cool and shoot carefully. And when you read what he actually goes on and writes about that, as far as that goes, he notes that most people, most trained law enforcement officers, when they fail in the field, it's not because they lack technical ability. It was an issue of emotional control. And finally, to the consternation of the bunny huggers, Cooper says probably the best thing, the bang for the buck for developing mindset is hunting in some way, shape, or form. And I would say this: the closer you are to the what you're trying to get, the more primitive the weapon you're using, and the more likely it is to kill you, probably the greater value. Uh, the I've had people talk to about experience. Probably the best thing you can do, continental United States, is go hunt big feral hogs on foot with your service handgun. Okay, if you can do that, you can probably keep your feces coagulated to a point that emotional control is going to be less of an issue. But I would also point out none of these singular activities do this for us. It is literally a lifelong pursuit of, to a certain degree, choosing to do the hard thing, whether it's like a cold plunge, a sauna, or something like that. If you're uncomfortable doing it, it probably has some value.
Okay. Good. Good answers, John. Randy, can you talk about? I mean, I think John would probably agree. You know, I've known you for several years, probably getting close to 20-ish, and you have like the exact same demeanor whether you're about to step to the line to compete for a turbo pin or whether you are you know, you're just like the same mellow dude all the time. And um, how do you think that emotional control plays into the, you know, you do just about as much competition as anybody I know. You were talking about, you just did the SIG one earlier today. So how do you think emotional control plays in competition? And do you see the polar opposite of that with competitors who have skill, but they have no emotional control?
That could be a 3-hour episode all in of itself. As far as my own emotional control, according to Hearn, as I was drinking a lot of water one morning at breakfast, he was like, "That's where the ice water in his veins comes from." So I about spit it out on the table. Um, I would say, from a standpoint of um, competitive shooting, well, first of all, let's talk about my somewhat monotone demeanor. What almost nobody knows about me in the gun world, anyways. I was not always the strapping, large muscled person that I am now. I actually played basketball at a fairly high level in high school. We were actually the number one ranked team in the state in our classification. And so we had a pretty good coach, and the one of the things that he always told us was never get too high, never get too low. Try to stay on an even keel, and that way your emotions won't control what you're doing. Because in putting it in sports parlance there. If you're down 3 points with 7 seconds on the clock, that is not the time to start panicking. That's the time to run the play and get the best shot that you can get.
Yeah.
And that's the difference between winners and losers is being able to control that emotionally. When you think about dudes that drive cars around Talladega at 200 miles an hour, you've got to have some emotional control to keep from ending up just dead. I mean, that's one of the most dangerous things you can do. So, as far as from the competitive shooting standpoint, yes, gunfight stress and going to a match stress are two different kind of stresses. Is there a little bit of overlap? There is a little bit of overlap, but it's not the same kind of stress. But I've felt both of those, so I can actually speak to both of them. I've had somebody attack me, and I've had to pull a gun to, prevent that from happening. I've also shot at fairly high level matches. If you call the IDPA World Match a fairly high level match. Starting out, generally, when we see with most people is um, you come to your first couple of matches, and it's the Hurton talked about jumping out of a perfectly good airplane, and mentioned SEALs early. I was actually having a discussion with a SEAL one time about the first time he jumped out of a perfectly good airplane. He said everything's going by just like this, and he's like, before I knew it, I was on the ground. He says the fifth or sixth jump after that, I'm just kind of floating through the air, checking my altimeter, all this stuff, because you're used to it now. and it doesn't have the same emotional component that it did before. So you get guys coming to a match, their first match, they about pee on themselves when the buzzer goes off because, they completely forget their plan, all that, everything's moving so fast. 10 years into it, you're able to control all that stuff because you're used to it now. So, like John talks about in class, in who wins, who loses, and why, you've got Officer A and Officer B. Officer B, who's, if I remember it correctly, I think it's Officer B. Officer B, who has his mental mapping is down. He knows what to expect. He knows his skills are good. He's not having the same panic reaction that Officer A is having. So,
Gotcha.
If I could just chime in here, I think one of the great secrets to Randy has just been revealed because I know I have all this weird stuff. The other person in the gun world who was a very excellent high school basketball player was actually Michael Platt, the bad guy in the Miami FBI shooting. I actually have a quote pulled up. His high school basketball coach, the direct quote about him was, quote, he wasn't one to get rattled easily. So it all makes a lot more sense now.
Huh.
oh well.
Well, that's interesting. I still think about your Platt and Maddox piece, John, whenever I do laundry on the road, because I have that same laundry bag that Platt and Maddox had, that green drawstring one that I inherited from Gomez.
The 1986 Go Bag.
Yeah.
Well, let me jump in there real quick while we're mentioning Platt and Maddox, and this is in no way to glorify them, because they're scumbag criminals. But if you look at what happened there, you've basically got, if we pull any kind of affiliation out of it, and we're not looking at good guys versus bad guys. Okay, so what happens? Dude gets attacked by 8, 9 guys. What does he do? He gets to work. Okay, he didn't panic and throw his gun down, throw his hands up. He unloaded out the window at dudes, crawls out the window while he's being shot, gets shot numerous times, yet he keeps on fighting. What is that? That's emotional control. It may not be on the side that we normally root for, but there's something that we can learn from that, that keep on fighting. And kind of along those same lines, and I hope I'm not butchering this. I'm sure somebody will chime in out in the interwebs and say, nope, that's not exactly it. But Travis Haley talks about in the selection course that he went through, and I guess that's Marine Recon maybe. Anyways, he talks about there's like 3 people left, and they had just gotten through doing this horrendous road march or whatever. They get to the end of it, and then a truck pulls up, and they say, all right, guys, get on the truck. We're on to the next part. And 2 guys were just like, yeah, screw it. We're done. And then Haley is like, okay, I'm getting on the truck. As soon as he got on the truck, they said, yep, it's over. You're in. And, the other 2 guys, if they'd just taken 2 more steps and gotten in the truck, they'd be in too. But it's just, don't quit. So there is no quit. I tell people in class, you've got to develop a mindset to where you are not willing to lose. Um, because we don't know what, 50 years ago, losing was what, losing your wallet. Now it's a whole lot different. It's, people will kill you just for no reason. So if you're going to fight, it's fight like you're the third monkey on the way up the ramp to the ark and the rain just started falling. So,
yeah. Tammy, I know that you teach specifically a lot of female students because I've seen your posts about it, but do you feel like emotional control is something that you see more expressed in female students versus male students, or do you think it's something that is about equal or lopsided the other direction?
So I teach both, but I do teach a lot of women, mostly because I teach a lot of brand new shooters. And I see a little bit of it with both. It's a different kind of emotional control, or the need for emotional control. With the women, more times they need to control their fear, as opposed to, like, with men, they need to control their aggressiveness.
Right.
So it's both different kinds of emotional control. And I saw that. So I was not a police officer, but I worked for 13 years in child welfare.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw that a lot in child welfare, kind of going back to what John was talking about. The people who, it could be argued that next to a life and death situation, having the state coming and taking away your kids is probably one of the most stressful things that can happen to you. And time again, the people who were able to control their emotions, do what they had to do, got their kids back. And the people who weren't able to control their emotions lost their kids permanently. We just saw that over and over again. And oddly enough, we reintegrated with more men than women. Where I'm at. We sent kids home to their dads way more often than we sent kids home with their moms. I think part of that, women tend to be more emotional, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just how we're wired. You know, men are men and women are women for a reason. And so with women, if you can get to them early and get them calmed down, I think you have a better chance with them. Especially as the female instructor, sometimes really aggressive men don't want to listen to me until I show them why they should listen to me, where women will kind of take you at face value if you can explain what's going on and get them calmed down.
Yeah.
But I've also seen women just be completely, I had a female instructor dress me down for 20 minutes because I told her, hey, just so you know, I don't teach pinning the trigger, and just like word vomited on me for 20 minutes. So women can have a lot of issues with aggression too, not just like controlling their fear.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I've obviously taught both female and male students before, and I feel like you know, a lot of times female students come to training for different reasons than men do, and unfortunately, many of them come to it from a background because they were victimized in some way, and those that specific sub demographic of student, I think, has its own challenges because you can be the loudest person in the world and they're not going to hear you because you're not louder than the voices that they hear in their head that are what compelled them to get there in the first place. So yeah, but I do really enjoy seeing I don't know what you call it. Well, I always call it like when people get their mojo back, like when these, especially when there's people that have been victims of crime, whether they're male or female, and when you see that the reason that they're there is almost out of desperation, that's the last straw for them, that they're finally not going to keep feeling this way. And then when you see it, actually there's like a glimmer of it, you can see that there's some positivity and some positive movement in the direction that now they feel like they do have the locus of control back in their court, that it makes a bigger difference. Yeah, that's a good thing.
No, I agree. I think and that's kind of been a pet project of mine that I've been working on, is just working with people who have experienced some sort of trauma, because I've seen a lot of students. I had one student come in, she lived in a bad area. She wanted to learn how to shoot to protect herself, but she had been standing next to her brother when he was murdered by someone with a gun. And so she just, even being in the building, it was and hearing the gunshots out on the range caused her a lot of stress. And it took a lot of time. Fortunately, the range I was at the time, we had a Milo range. And so we went in there and shut the door and turned the sound off on the range, and just let her shoot until she was comfortable, and we inched it up. And yeah, that moment when she was like, okay, I can do this, I am ready to go out on the range, and just how empowered she felt. And I have a lot of women over and over, they're like, I feel so empowered now, having learned how to do this.
Yeah. It's a screwy thing, like, especially when it's always funny because we talk so much about the sympathetic nervous system response, and John talks about it at great length in several of his lectures, and you don't realize that anxiety in general is a misfiring of the sympathetic nervous system. It's an artificial added stress to the fight or flight response, and so it's funny. I remember I had a student one time, and her hands sweat so severely that the only way that she could even shoot on the range without like losing her grip completely was to wear gardening gloves, like those cloth gardening gloves with the little rubber nubs on them. And but by the end of 16ish, hour, probably by hour 13 or so, she didn't have to wear the gloves anymore because she was, further out of her sympathetic nervous system and more towards a point of homeostasis instead of being that agitated. But yeah, those are always like the things that, you do this for years and years and years, that's, nobody's doing this to get rich. Like, you do it for other reasons. And I think that that's like one of the most rewarding things to see is when you see somebody that's that just terrified, get to a point where they're functional and they're able to think with a gun in their hand. That's an impressive mental feat.
I've said it before, I'll say it again. Every good firearms instructor is an unlicensed mental health counselor. And if you don't have that tool set, you really need to develop it, because you're going to encounter people like this, the flinchies, whatever you call them. A lot of times that is fear of the gun, whether you want to admit it or not. So having something in your tool bag to be able to deal with that is just the reality of being an effective firearms instructor.
Yeah, for sure.
And it doesn't even have to be something super traumatic. I had a female student, and it was just in a very basic pistol class, and she's sitting in the back of the classroom, and we've just started, and she is just crying, just tears rolling down her face. And at the first break, I went back and I kind of talked to her to see what was going on. And she was raised in Canada, and she had been so just like brainwashed that guns were evil. Just being in a building with them had completely stressed her out.
Yeah.
She was a great shot by the time we were done. But yeah, it was just, it wasn't even something traumatic, just guns are evil.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a strange thing, and I think that the emotional control, it's, another large group of people that we could probably study fairly effectively. John, this is another thought for TACCON 2025 is professional golfers. The amount of composure that it takes to not lose it. And that's where you have, really interesting characters like John Daly come in, who, has only ever been in trouble for the opposite of performance enhancing drugs. He's only taken performance de-enhancing drugs. Yeah. So, yeah, that's a good point.
Well, there's a whole realm of sports psychology out there. They generally refer to it as choking, right? And Lee posted we have a little group that goes back and forth, but apparently he said that he found a study where if you look at somebody's first couple of foul shots in practice, has a largely predictive effect on whether they're going to win the later game, right? So that ability to perform under that peak stress, I mean, that's the problem with the gun world is there's not much money here in studying this. So what you end up doing is you end up relying on studying related fields, whether it's basketball players doing foul shots, golfers trying to make difficult putts. You end up looking at similar fields and extrapolating to a certain degree when it comes to this material.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll jump in real quick on the basketball thing there. One of the things we did as far as free throws goes, that would determine how much we ran at the end of practice. And so you actually had a stress component in there to the performing the skill, because you get up there in front of everybody. If I miss this, we've all got to run. And so that pretty much, helps you build. You either get real good at running or real good at free throw shooting, one of the two. So that's dudes are at home doing their own work, shooting free throws, and building that mental toughness to not have it bother you when you have to step up there in front of everybody. Because if the same dude keeps missing free throws and making us run, it's not going to be pleasant for that dude for very long. So,
yeah, that's a good point. Well, anybody else have anything else on emotional control that you want to talk about, John?
I just chime in that it's a lifelong pursuit. And again, to sound like your mother, just good physical conditioning seems to mitigate a lot of this. And, go do something that you suck at. That's the advantage of BJJ. It's kind of a combination of both. But, being strong, having a good aerobic base, all that has huge benefits, not just in this world, but that's what you're probably going to die of realistically, right? So it's definitely going to bump up the not so much the lifespan as the health span is what I'm trying to focus on at this point in my life. So all that's bennies.
Yeah, agreed.
And I'll throw in one more thing real quick here at the end. Talking about dealing with new shooters, basically what we've got to do is develop trust with them, that they trust us, that what we're telling them is legit. Then we're going to build competence in the skills, which then in turn lifts their confidence level and makes them feel empowered. So to help them with controlling their emotions, like we are talking about earlier, with folks that get there that have maybe been the victim of crime, or or have grown up somewhere where it's just not not kosher to own guns. That's what we've got to do. And competency builds confidence. The other thing is there's a great quote from a pretty obscure movie. It was M. Night Shyamalan movie, The Village, where what's his name? I'll think of it in a minute. Anyways, the hero of the story, he says when these creatures come and attack or whatever, Bryce Dallas Howard, her character asks it, what's Joaquin Phoenix, asks him, aren't you afraid? And he says, I don't worry about what might happen. I focus on what must be done. And that's kind of encapsulating emotional control there. I'm not worrying about what might happen. I'm focusing on what I've got to do. And, that's it.
Very good. All right. Well, the next segment I wanted to talk about is the topic of instructor credibility. So, I talked about this briefly in my presentation at TACCon this last year about, specifically talking to people of the civilian defender, lifestyle, just regular folks. So people that aren't, on duty law enforcement, people that aren't on duty military, specifically geared towards personal self-defense. And, one of the things that I talked about was, training with people who are credible instructors. And, I have a concept in my mind of what that looks like, but I wanted to kind of like shoot it out to you guys so that we could have a discussion about it. And then I have a couple specific, little trenches I want to take us down. So, John, when you think about instructor credibility, when you're describing the attributes of someone who's a credible instructor, what do you come to the table with?
My first question is, an instructor for what? Because I think you've got to match the instructor to the material being taught, right?
Sure.
If you're teaching basic students, that's going to require a different kind of person. The same as shout out, Tiffany and Ock have a pretty good handle on how to deal with those gateway students. Anytime you're dealing with those gateway students, that's going to take a very much a different person to handle those people and teach them, convey the information in something that's meaningful, as opposed to someone teaching a different class. I think I first heard this from Mike Seeklander, and I think it's a pretty good starting point. He was talking about what it takes to be a good firearms instructor. He says, you've got to have a body of knowledge and the ability to convey it, right? And I would put in parentheses, if you're in the public safety side, you've got to have that admin fight for the budget side going on in there as well. But if you think about that body of knowledge and the ability to convey it, it's, those are two distinctly different skills, right? The body of knowledge is what you can do, what you know about art. And, more importantly, it doesn't matter how great you are. I think we're all very familiar with some incredibly gifted shooters who can do the thing remarkably well, but perhaps their ability to convey what they do is lacking. Just do what I'm doing is not the most instructive most useful instructor methodology out there. So I think what we're looking to do when we think about instructor credibility is thinking about what is their body of knowledge, what is their ability to convey that, and does it match up with what I'm trying to do, which, I've read about this for years. brings us to the whole problem of, brand differentiation in the shooting industry, because John and Jane Citizen really don't know what the difference is between an NRA instructor, a USCCA instructor, a range master instructor, or, we can even, an NRA basic pistol instructor versus someone that's gone through the whole NRA personal defense outside of the home. Those are going to be two very different, hopefully, bodies of knowledge, as well as the ability to convey it. So, as part of that body of knowledge, so my final thought here, and I'll turn it over, is that person continuing to build their body of knowledge? Are they taking classes from other competent people on a regular basis? I don't think this is written in stone anywhere, but I'm deeply skeptical of anybody who claims to be a professional firearms instructor that isn't picking up at least 2 classes a year from somebody outside of their world.
Yeah. Gotcha. Tammy, what do you think? So you teach both gateway, students and, people that are more experienced and interested in training, thinking about cognitive skills, thinking with a gun in their hand. So what do you see as the variables there?
So I think John was pretty spot on. I think you have to have both the technical knowledge and then the ability to teach, which are two different things. And I think actually, in my opinion, the ability to teach is harder to obtain. You can gain the knowledge pretty easily, but if you don't have the personality to teach, that is hard to build. It doesn't mean it's not possible, but it's a little bit harder. So I share my story. I'm pretty open about it. I went, and mostly I became an instructor because I was helping someone run a shooting group. And I was like, well, it's kind of loosey-goosey and I want to have insurance just in case something happens. And so went and got my instructor certification. I was working at a range check-in at the time. Took my certificate up to the HR lady because I'm like, sometimes you get better insurance if you have more people with training. And that comes, my ex-husband was a firefighter. And so they're always like, we want everyone's certifications. It helps our insurance. And I gave it to her and she's like, well, do you want to teach? And I was like, sure. And so I started teaching, and I was teaching for 4 months when the president of the company, the CEO of the company, comes to me and he's like, hey, we want to interview you for the director of training position. And I was like, you want to what? Because I had been teaching for 4 months. Now I had taught a lot before. I taught first aid, CPR, and AED for Red Cross for a decade, and all of that. But mostly they wanted me because it was very important to them to have women in leadership positions. They bragged about that a lot. And I have a degree in marketing. And so a lot of the job was marketing, but I was completely not qualified for the director part. But it was me, or it was going to be a retired cop who hadn't taken training since he went to the academy, and he made students cry. Yeah. So I was like, okay, I'll take it. And I'm very fortunate that I have a lot of really great mentors. And, I was able to talk to Tom Givens about stuff, and I was able to talk to Chuck Hager, and he was very helpful in helping me get that. But I do think sometimes people get thrown into instructing sooner than they had intended. But if you realize that and you work hard to kind of fill in those gaps, I think that's okay, as long as you recognize that. But ideally, you want to have more experience and more training. But I don't think everyone has to be, especially with brand new shooters. I'm not out there teaching people how to run and gun because I don't have that skill set. And as long as people stay within their lane and can comfortably and confidently convey what they're teaching to the level of student they're teaching, that's what I really look for. I don't, sadly, I know women, especially instructors, I have found were really bad about this. I know a woman that took a 2-hour low light class, and now she's teaching other women low light training. And I'm like, I have taken Chuck Haggard's low light class like 6 times, and I'm still not comfortable teaching it. So I think that's one area of where instructors really cause themselves trouble, is when they start stepping outside of their lane. And you want to push yourself and do a little bit harder things, just like you do with your training. Otherwise, you're never going to grow. But but a big leap from, hey, I took a 2-hour class to now I'm teaching other people how to do that maybe isn't the best road to take.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I always tell people the best way to test your own knowledge on a particular subject area is to teach it, but it's a whole other thing to have the ability to teach it, but then also, be selling it. that's a different area entirely. So yeah, that's very good. Randy, tell us about your thoughts on instructor credibility.
Um, well, as Tammy mentioned before, you don't have to be a master level instructor to teach gateway folks. I mean, because you think about, back in college, I'm sure we all had graduate assistants teaching some class at some point. And, those folks don't, they're not doctors. They're not, they don't have a degree yet. So they're just graduate assistants. So at the basic level, um, and hopefully this comes out right, as long as they know more than the student does and they're keeping to the basics. Folks that just have an NRA certification maybe in one discipline, there's a place for that. But
Mm-hmm.
as we start trying to get more deeper into it, going a mile deep and 2 inches wide instead of 2 inches deep and a mile wide. You really need to have some contextual knowledge of how everything fits together. You need to know who was teaching what when. You need to know why we're teaching this now. We need to know why the stuff that maybe we were teaching in the 80s. Nobody that is, I would say, a progressive trainer, and I don't mean that in any political way. I mean that as progressive as in they keep developing their material, looking for the best stuff available. How they're maybe not teaching it exactly the way it was taught in 1980. So that's the, I would say, the hallmark of a good instructor is they keep learning, but it's not just adding new skills, it's adding depth and contextual knowledge of things. Just on my own, when Suarez made me the offer to come teach for him, I was like, okay, I am willing to do that, but there are a few people that I still need to train with to get a broader view of things. And honestly, I went and took 12 classes in 13 months,
Mm-hmm.
and that trained with different organizations and stuff just to make sure I had a pretty good grasp of what the heartbeat of the industry was at that point. And then I read stuff all the time. I keep up with, I would say, forums, but forums are just about dead. Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff. Trying to keep an eye on what's developing, what are folks doing in this particular area. Why that looks interesting. Let's test this. But you're always trying to keep developing and just make yourself a better instructor, so that what I don't want somebody to ask me a question and I think, holy crap, I have no idea anything about that. I can at least give you a decent answer and do a little research and get back to you with the answer that I feel comfortable giving you. So, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things, just kind of expound on what you said, like I'm really big on when I teach and also when I learn, like I want to know the why. Like, why am I doing this way? And why am I doing this way? One of the things that I really like about, like, Tom, for example, also Gomez was really, really good at this. He was almost too good at it, in fact, was explaining the historical background behind the why. And like, why are we doing it this way? When it's been done these other ways in the past and things like this. And so, you know, some people might say that that's silly, and it's like minutia and historical, things that aren't really important. But I beg to differ in that, like, if you really don't understand the why behind what you're doing, you don't really possess the skill. You're just literally using your mirror neurons to copy somebody else without any ownership of it. So, um, Yeah, I agree with that, man. I think
On
So
that
there was
oh, go ahead, Tammy.
Oh, I was gonna say I was reading a discussion on Facebook kind of along that same line earlier today. They were talking about USCCA in particular. And once you take, as an instructor, you take their initial instructor development, it's an in-person class. But then to add their additional classes, you watch like a 2 hour, 3 hour online video, and then you're certified to teach that class, their curriculum. And somebody commented, you're not an, if your only knowledge of a subject is a 2 hour online class you took, you're not an instructor, you're a tape recorder spitting back someone else's information.
yeah, yeah, that's right.
If you only watch the video once, you're probably not a very good tape recorder. I mean,
Right.
one of the things that I found interesting, because I guess there's like what we end up doing, there's like ideal. In a lot of ways, what Tom did at the original Rangemaster range was interesting in that he had a lot of instructor candidates coming through. And a lot of times you'd maybe see them shooting Friday night league. So you could maybe sometimes know who was shooting. You could watch them work through the stress of the class. And every once in a while you'd kind of cherry pick it. I guess it was selection in a certain way. A couple of guys that had interest in it. And you would come in and it was very much an apprentice process. You would help teach classes. I can't tell you how many of his level twos, which is, we're drawing, it's where you teach people to draw from the holster. So it's the most dangerous class you can teach, right? How many of those I helped teach before I even remotely thought about being able to do that. And I think that's part of the problem in the market right now is you have people offering quote unquote instructor classes because everybody loves an instructor credential. But the problem is they're not teaching the instructional part of the equation that we need to work on. For instance, I really enjoyed Paul Howe's instructor program because you had to present material in front of real people. The way his is structured, and I find it fascinating, is that he has standards. You're expected to show up on day one and shoot to his standards so he can teach you all the rest of the stuff, right? So you go through the entire week. Hopefully, you test out on his standards, but you are assigned a block to teach in front of live students in front of class. And, that it's one of the few instructional classes in which you actually kind of teach to a true student body as opposed to doing teach backs in front of your other classmates as far as that goes. And I think that's that working on that instructor portion of this is absolutely valuable, and probably where a lot of the low hanging fruit in the industry is, but it's not sexy to sell.
Yeah.
If they
Do
had
you
a class where
think?
you were teaching from a flaming helicopter, then maybe it would sell better.
Yeah. So let me ask you this: do you think, you know, thinking about how the industry's changed, 10, 15 years ago, if you didn't have LEO or military experience, teaching to the civilian, CCW, strictly personal self-defense crowd was, you know, kind of, if there was someone that didn't have those, prior vocations in their background, then, people would kind of look at them sort of, suspicious. I think that that's changed a lot, and kind of matured, and I think it's probably for good reason because, as we've talked about before, there's, um, not a good amount of overlap in the missions of those three different groups of people. So, and Randy, I know you've been there through it from the beginning. So, how do you feel about, like, it's really illustrative of when you have people who are outside of the firearms industry who, when they find out that you're a quote unquote gun guy or a gun gal or a gun person, that I'm not sure why the balloons just went off, but that's interesting.
Glad everybody else saw that too. I was starting to
I don't
panic.
know if it's I did do this and it does it automatically. Shoot, I guess so. Interesting. Didn't know that was a thing, but we all learned something today. So, but yeah, you try it,
It
John.
worked for me. Damn it.
I was worrying about what was actually in that taco I ate earlier. The food truck.
If you're not watching the YouTube version of this, you're missing out, guys. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. But you've been there since the beginning, Randy. So do you feel like has the paradigm shifted to where law enforcement and military background is no longer a prerequisite to instructor credibility?
I would hope so, but I mean, there's still vast pockets of, folks that are like, well, we were just talking about this today at that match, and I'm not in any way trying to disparage, folks that are out there protecting us, but the average person on the street has probably a much inflated view of what the actual skill level is of the typical street cop. Now, are
Oh,
there some dudes out there patrolling the streets that are, T-Rexes? Absolutely, but those dudes are few and far between. And John, didn't you I'm hoping I'm remembering this correctly. Didn't you post the thing in one of the groups on Facebook about the different skill levels or whatever, where the guy went and tested police officers versus like IDPA shooters? Was that you?
he basically had his whole department shoot the IDPA classifier.
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely. And it was very I mean, to me, disconcerting as far as that stuff goes. How low the level of the law enforcement was. One of the things that I'm actually writing an article that Gale House will hopefully publish on the value of technical skill for law enforcement officers. And one of the things that just occurred to me the other day, and I think this is part of what's going on, is there's this bizarre paradox in the law enforcement training world, in that on the private sector side, we have never shot better. Equipment, holsters, shooting knowledge, how to run the gun fast and accurately has never been better. Right. So, the private sector side, skills are going. I think you can make a very compelling argument on the law enforcement side of the house. They've given up. I know of at least 2 states now who do not require their officers to shoot past 12 yards. So, the law enforcement, I think, has kind of taken itself out of the game because the material that most academies offer is so abysmal as far as that stuff goes. And, one of the things I saw with my experience with my agency is that agencies are far more reluctant to allow their officers to teach outside of the agency as well. So I think to a large degree, the law enforcement side of the equation is kind of taking itself out as far as relevance, because nobody sees cops doing good work very much anymore. I mean, unless the handling, the Seattle Police Department deserves full kudos for the handling of the pedophile, fouling the draw and burning that guy down. But we rarely see good work done like that anymore. And if you do see good work done like that anymore, it's always put under some social justice lens in which this poor victim of our evil capitalist society was, brutalized by the police. The shooting, I don't know if y'all saw it in Chicago about 2 weeks ago, where the bad guy fired 11 times at the cops. He started shooting at the cops first, and because he was in a vehicle, they shot 94 shots were fired. They didn't hit him 94 times, but oh my god, they shot this guy 94 times. Well, no, they shot at him, but I mean, it's that relatively good work. When they finally got a hold of him and chewed him up pretty good, that was put under the lens. This was somehow completely unjustified. So law enforcement has been taken out both by themselves and I think in a larger social context as well.
Mm-hmm. So steering that back into your question, you still have large groups of just everyday folks who think, oh well, he's a cop, he knows about guns, he was in the military, he knows about guns. And maybe not. If you look at the Uvalde school shooting a couple of years ago, you've got 2 very different reactions. You have the Uvalde PD who did what they did, and then you have the border patrol BORTAC people, their tactical unit guys who went in and ended that. 2 completely different reactions from 2 law enforcement agencies. So are there some great law enforcement instructors out there? Absolutely, that are also teaching the public, but it doesn't mean that you have to be a good instructor. Again, if we're looking at, do you have the skill set, do you have the knowledge, can you convey that to the students? If that's what we're really looking for, there's not really a job description pinned to that, and you can acquire knowledge a lot easier now than you could say 50, 60 years ago. So it's that's my opinion on it. So
I would also say that I think price point is driven stuff. One of the things I've refused to get into is Mississippi is a state that offers an enhanced permit, and there are these guys that just offer this 1 day 30 or 40 people class, and like they're charging $79 a head, and it's a pretty good payday, but the quality just is not there, right? They're just churning it out. But the reason they're quote unquote successful is because nobody cares about their background, their resume, their ability to have knowledge and to convey it to others. A lot of people are looking at the price tag, and again, I think it goes back to the brand differentiation issue when it comes to this material. Why would I pay? If I can go take the class for $79 from this person, one of my wife's friends asked me for recommendations. Like my husband and I want to take a Tennessee permit class, and I very much sent her to the range master crew at Top Gun, and I get a note back. Hey, I found a Groupon deal for this, and my snide comment was great. That's just what I want to do, is to learn how to run a chainsaw or fly an airplane based on the low bid.
Yeah, exactly.
There's really why I'm not
You
allowed
know,
to talk to my wife's friends.
yeah. Well, I mean, especially with permit classes, there we all know there are a lot of people who just want to, they don't really care about learning a whole lot. They just want to get the piece of paper or, get the little card so that if they get pulled over, they're not in trouble.
Right.
That's the thing
That's probably
because
most people.
I'm sorry, run that by me again.
That's probably most people. That's
Yeah,
probably
yeah,
90% of people.
yeah. Well, from Carl Wren's work on, what is it? 1% take a second class. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and
Yeah.
I had a
It's
little something on the law enforcement thing too. So I actually have people come to me specifically because I wasn't former law enforcement. I get them there, they'll come and they'll be like, I don't want to take a class from a police officer. They're worried about they're going to be like drill sergeants and yell at them or be mean to them. So they'll come specifically because I'm not law enforcement. I'll also occasionally get, so I live in a pretty liberal, the political liberal community, and I will get people come to me because they have a bad opinion of law enforcement or they've had a negative run-in with law enforcement, and so they're wanting to take training from someone who isn't from that background. So there is some people who specifically look for non-law enforcement trainers also.
Yeah,
yeah.
and one thing that those folks who are not LE trainers, and that's one thing a lot of people don't understand. There are things that LE guys can do, and John and Sherman, you'll back me up on this, I'm sure. There are things you can do because you're carrying a badge that the average person, it gets them thrown in jail if they do it.
Right.
That's one of the things with if your average everyday citizen points a gun at somebody else, there's a crime being committed somewhere. Either the other person was committing a crime and caused you to defend yourself, or you're committing aggravated assault by pointing that gun at them. Whereas police with a badge, historically speaking, it's pretty much you pointed at whoever and the badge pretty much covers you. Now, are we getting more, as from some of Eric Galehouse's work, especially presentation that he did at the professional trainer symposium back in December in Nashville. He's talking about, you're starting to see more officers getting charged with just kind of randomly pointing their guns at people willy nilly. But for, decades, that's one of those things that you can essentially get away with, air quotes, that the average person can't. If your gun becomes visible and you've got a big old badge next to it, nobody thinks anything about it. So one thing that, I tell people, I'm like, well, no, I'm not a police officer, but I've spent the last 20 plus years moving about in public carrying concealed weapons. And, I know how to basically how to help you act and interact in public without getting yourself in trouble. Whereas the badge solves a lot of those problems for the LE guys. And so they don't even give it a second thought about, well, what if my gun becomes visible? Who cares? I've got a badge. What if, but for depending on where you live, and quite possibly if from what you said about your political area there, Tammy, it could be, is it brandishing? Is it, if the gun becomes visible, is that now going to cause you a problem? So those are all things that the typical LE instructor may or may not even ping their radar because their life, their experiences haven't, had that.
A couple of things I'll throw out there is that, when we had the mothership in Memphis, a goodly portion of our people would be people who struggled to shoot, like, either worked for Memphis PD or Shelby County Sheriff's Office. and they would have to come in and get tuned up before each qualification because they knew their agency was going to do it. And trying to be discreet here, there may have been a few cases in which problem students were directed to us that weren't going to pass the academy. And it's like, it was literally, as far as the instructor cadre was concerned, magic was sprinkled on that person, because you have people coming in when they left the range and they weren't, they're shooting for score, they're failing, and all of a sudden they're shooting 95%. And it's like, what magic did you do? And a lot of times it was something as simple as, an eye dominance issue that had been unrecognized by the instructor staff as far as that stuff goes. So, I think that that body of knowledge for a law enforcement instructor, I think, has gotten more shallow over the years as far as that stuff goes. You know, I'm beginning to appreciate my grizzly old firearms instructors that shot PPC and could run a revolver or run any semi-automatic with a great deal of aplomb. And, that ability to run multiple gun platforms. So, one of the problems when Tom set up the Range Master Instructor program, it was because none of the local firearms instructors that he could find from that LE school were appropriate for teaching private citizens. It was just, that program developed because the pool was so limited.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then let me throw in one more thing real quick, because you had mentioned earlier about how, civilian, LE, and military do, different things. And so one of the ways I describe that is, you may have a Ferrari, you may have a pickup truck, and you may have a bulldozer. Those are all vehicles, but they all do drastically different things. And you probably don't need a bulldozer driver trying to teach you how to drive your Ferrari, just like your Ferrari driver doesn't need to be teaching the guy in the pickup truck how to drive. Because if he tries to drive it like that guy drives the Ferrari, he's going to flip that thing over. So you kind of need to, be able to find somebody that's teaching you what it is that you're looking to learn, as opposed to just, oh, they know about guns because they're in the Army, they're in the, they're a cop, they're, a competitive shooter, whatever. So
yeah, agreed. Well, good. I always thought that a really good assessment/test class was the ShivWorks EDP class that, there was a team up with Tom and Craig Douglas and William April. And then, of course, William April passed away a few years ago during the pandemic. And that class is, since become, that was the last one. And I've often thought, John, that, if William had a say in the matter, he would tell you to take up his mantle as the third apex in that triangle, and start the EDP coursework over again, because I think that it really is a good way to test emotional control. Like whether you are in simunitions ranges, doing force on force exercises, or you're actually doing, timed shooting assessments. Both of those require a high level of emotional control to be successful in that class. Then the part that's most humiliating about it is that your successes and your failures are videoed and shown to the entire class and debriefed. And so everybody's got to be pretty honest in that class, at least honest with, I mean, I guess they have to be honest with their classmates. They don't necessarily have to be honest with themselves. They could still lie to themselves and tell themselves that they think they're great if they had an abysmal performance. But I think that would, that's such a great class. And I think that people get a lot out of it. And I think that, of course, you're very good at this too, but, Tom and William and Craig are good at adding additional stress to you through various means. So I think that that's a very good coursework for people to have if they've had it in the past, and maybe you all can do a reboot of it in the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that vote of confidence there, and there have been discussions along those ends. We don't, there's no date set or anything like that, but it's certainly, idea has certainly been floated as far as that stuff goes. Just a fun story. You talk about people, being able to induce stress. We can be the fancy term for it, but when I went through EDP at BDC Gun Club, it actually the stress level was such that I was able my cold sores popped up, and that is the result of immunosuppression from the extended stress of what was it, a 2 or 3 day class? I can't remember now at this point.
3. Yeah.
3 day class, 3 days of stress induction. Actually starts to manifest itself if it's done well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. That may be a topic for another podcast at some point, for folks that aren't aware of what the EDP class was. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah, I'll put in a word with the management.
There you go. So,
all right,
because we might know some people that have been to that class. So
yeah, a couple.
Yeah.
I have an interesting story to tell about that class. I'll save it if we ever do that episode. So
good.
But final thoughts, Tammy, take us out.
Just so for the people watching who aren't instructors, because we talked a lot about instructors, going back to that, instructor credibility, what to look for, I think is something good for us to kind of touch on real quick. And we touched on it a little bit. Look for people who are continuing to take training, not people who are, this is the way, but more of this is my way. And, other people do it other ways. Figure out which way works best for you. But I want you to do it my way today, kind of thing. I was telling some people this weekend, I was teaching at the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks BOW program, which is becoming an outdoors woman, and had a bunch of women who had never touched a gun before. And we were talking a little bit about, hey, next steps, go to the range, what to look for. So, if you have an instructor, I had a woman tell me that she had gone to took a class once, and we had covered safety. We did the 4 firearm safety rules and all that, and she's like, nobody told me this before. And actually my co-teacher who was with me, a friend who's not an instructor, I brought her as an assistant this weekend, and she had taken a shotgun course at that, and she's like, we didn't talk about safety. Like in the shotgun class, she's like, they said, don't point this at anyone, this is the ammunition, this is the gun, put it in here and shoot. And that caused some concern about the credibility of that instructor. So look for things like that. Look to make sure they're having some sort of safety briefing, and that they're being safe. And then look and see if they're training more.
Very good. Randy, final thoughts?
I would just say on the emotional control, the better your emotional control is, the less likely you may have to use the skills that you developed. So there's something to be said for folks that don't get rattled easily. And people can read that. If you look at the information from police officers killed in line of duty, so that folks that that presented well and seemed competent, they were less likely to try anything. The offenders were less likely to try anything with them, and that's emotional control also. So just develop that just like you develop mindset. Do strenuous things, do difficult things, do things that scare you, and all of that. It again, competency builds confidence, and people can read that. So that's my advice to folks. And just a quick side note, those of you watching, if you're wondering why, if the screen says Brandy, if you can see that, and you're wondering about all the Disney stuff in the background, I'm in my wife's office on her computer. So
very good.
One thing I have to mention is that when Randy cuts you a check for helping him co-teach a weekend, it actually comes on a Disney princess check. I was quite surprised when I opened the envelope and saw that.
Was it Ariel, or was it who was it? Do you
It was
remember?
Ariel.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, the wife and I have
a
Disney
4-year-old
checks.
daughter. I'm justified in knowing who Ariel is.
There you go. Yeah, the wife and I have Disney checks. So, anyways.
That's awesome. All right, John.
Dude, emotional control is one of those skills you got to build constantly, but it has it's a lifelong pursuit, but it has lifelong rewards. Whether it's in a boardroom, there's a general rule: the more you want to say something, the more you probably shouldn't. All that firmly seats itself in that realm of emotional control. So work on it all the time. Go do hard things. You'll get rewards for it.
Mm-hmm. Very good. All right. Well, thank you everybody on the panel for joining in tonight and having a kind of a weird, I enjoy the esoteric discussions more than I enjoy the, red dots versus irons and, all of the other like typical thoughts that are very photogenic and popular on social media these days. I like to spend time, out in the weeds talking about these things that are a little more ethereal and maybe a little bit harder to stick your thumb on. And I appreciate you all and being very good sports to play along with me. And I hope that Lee is pleased in his absence and that he invites me back to do this again when he needs somebody to come by and make things a little weird. So thank you, everybody out there listening. And we appreciate you spending your time with us.